This is Graham Scott here, and you're listening to the Agile Uprising podcast.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I am your host, Jay Hersko, and joining with me today, we have a repeat guest, the guru of throughput accounting, the man who just put out the book, Practice Makes Profit, the Small Business Owner's Guide to Making More Money by Not Working Harder, Mr. Graham Scott. Graham, thank you so much for joining us again.
Oh, thank you very much for having me back on the show, Jay. I'm glad I didn't blot my copybook last time.
No, you did it was fantastic last time. So let's dive in. So we kind of briefly touched on this when we had our first conversation, but you actually built it into an entire conversation, right? And the backdrop of the book is you speaking with a dermatologist. So we said in the last show, you're a classically educated accountant, but you also use a lot of these throughput accounting principles when it comes to working with your clients to find the best thing that they do, the best thing they should spend their money on. Right. Which is kind of something you really don't hear about fairly often, which is kind of wild.
Yeah. I think the whole thing about this is, to me, the principles, the philosophy behind theory of constraints and throughput accounting make such common sense, but I don't know why it's just not out there as common practice. I don't know if the way it's told to the public doesn't resonate or quite what it is. So what I wanted to do with this book is make these principles available to people in a way that they could relate to. A lot of short stories, analogies, examples of how you can use these principles to massively make a difference to your business. And I think, yes, it's based around small business practice, but I think most people will see the analogies, and I think this is an area that small business can teach big business about.
Absolutely. I mean, we've all of us that have spent time, any of our listeners that have spent time in these giant enterprise behemoths, we typically throw good money after bad. And we'll optimize things that are away from the constraint. And those listeners that remember our whole series on the Takasans, right, the theory of constraints series that we did last year, you're really just basically throwing money down a well. Is really what you're doing. So in the book, you start with, you're talking to a dermatologist named David. And he, and for those of you that don't know what a dermatologist is, it's someone who works with skin problems, right? Carcinoma, it could be warts, could be lesions, what have you, right? And what starts as just a quick conversation, you actually walk him through the focusing steps, and you get him to, and we were talking before we started recording, where some of these things, I guarantee you in hindsight, he stopped and went back and went, well, duh. Like, why wouldn't I think of that? And that's the part of the narrative that to me really jumped out, because it makes you, in, like you said, in the small business context, understand how to apply a lot of this stuff. So the first thing let's talk about is the idea of a bottleneck, right? So maybe there might be a chance that our listeners didn't listen to the previous series, but the idea of a bottleneck when it comes to theory of theory of constraints is there is one constraint in your system, in your process, and that is the thing which is your rate determining step. That's how much comes through your process is dependent upon that one thing. And like we just said, any money spent not optimizing that thing is kind of just money wasted, because no matter what you do, that's going to be that's going to set the pace, right? The goal, Bugelli gold rat, drum buffer rope. And then there's a quote you have later in the book, which to this point I think is very appropriate, where you said, if it doesn't help the bottleneck, don't spend the money.
Yep.
Right? If you're not going to optimize the bottleneck, don't spend the money. Go on, Graham.
Yeah. And just the rate that you can get work through the bottleneck determines the output of the whole system. That's the whole thing. And unfortunately, we have this idea that if every part of a system is efficient, is productive, then the whole system will be productive. And that's just not the case. If you have non-bottlenecks, working overtime, all they do is overload the whole system. You end up with work in progress everywhere, and the whole system just grinds to a halt. And the whole lean movement is based around keeping that work in progress right right across the whole organization. I think TOC has a slightly different slant and says you actually do need a bit of work in progress, a bit of buffer in front of the bottleneck, because you don't want the bottleneck to ever stop working. What you need is excess capacity feeding the bottleneck so that if something breaks further up the chain, it can catch up.
Right. And that ties to another quote you have in the book where you said you want your constraint to be efficient, but your non-constraints to be effective. So the constraint needs to be operating, like you said, there needs to be a buffer. It needs to be almost smooth sailing. But the other systems, it's okay to have a non-constraint sit idle. And that, Graham, for all of our listeners that are in knowledge work, that is like the hardest thing to impress upon the people we coach, we work with, we deal with. All they see is when you look at people as resources, right? As fungible tokens, right? What you do is you say, well, I'm paying however much an hour for that person, and I can't afford to have them sit idle. So let me go have them do the other thing. And you actually use an example in the book where you say you have this star developer who, because we don't want him to sit idle, he goes off and does other things, which ends up with a bunch of half-cocked work. And then all it does, like you said, is it mucks up the system.
Yeah. So this was on one of the courses where I teach this stuff. We had a guy who was a senior developer, team leader, and he came on the course convinced that he was surrounded by idiots, and what he needed to do to fix that, because he was overloaded, he needed to go and hire some more idiots. So the first question I always ask people when they complain about their staff is, why do you hire idiots? And of course they say, well, we don't hire idiots. So obviously the follow-up question is, well, what do you do to turn them into idiots? And yes, there's usually an eye roll and a blinding flash of insight as to what's happening. But when you've got people that feel they need to be busy all the time, they will start pulling work forward that is non-urgent. When they get stuck, they were going to this team leader, he had to drop urgent work and fix their problem because he didn't want them to be idle. And often what would take them 3 or 4 hours to fix, he could do it in half an hour. So it was more efficient for him to do it. And yet, as soon as he did that job, it was taking him away from the efficient stuff. But the worst thing was, it was freeing them up to go away and cause more problems for them.
Right. They just went back to the well, grabbed another ticket and created more
grabbed
disaster.
Something else that wasn't urgent and stuffed that up. And then it ended up in his in tray.
So it, and this is one of the steps. The first thing that anyone listening should think about is you need to think about finding that bottleneck. That's the first thing, right?
Yeah.
Find your constraint. And that is the most important step. And in your example with the dermatologist, David is the bottleneck, right? He is the doctor performing the procedures. So he is the bottleneck. So you need to keep him busy. And I think if I recall correctly, one of the scenario is you start talking about scheduling, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the issues is when you start talking about bottlenecks to people, they'll often say, oh, we've got bottlenecks all over the place. And if I'm getting into strict theory of constraint language, yes, you have bottlenecks that sometimes wander around, but the absolute bottleneck, the thing that is your real big bottleneck, is always referred to as the constraint. And sometimes it's not obvious where it is, and you think about where should it be. And basically, unless David is on the end of a scalpel or a laser, the business is making no money. So when we talked about this, it was obvious to him that he was the constraint. Before we started talking like that, his constraint was operating space, it was nurses, it was all over the place. And the example I use in the book, which I think really resonated with him because it was one of his stories, is he was also working part-time in the local public hospital, and some of the board of director members were wandering around the hospital, and they saw a couple of porters who sitting around having a chat. So obviously there was excess capacity in porters, so let's fire some and we'll save some money. And it's that cost accounting mentality that creeps in that does so much damage. So, of course, what happened? They fired a couple of porters, and then within a week or two, there was a crew of operating surgeons, nurses, anaesthetists, scrubbed up, ready to go, and there was no one to bring the patient to them from the wards. So a whole operating procedure got bumped. So this is why you need excess capacity, so that sort of thing doesn't happen. And once David realized he was the constraint, we could then start making sure that his operating slots, his 4-hour operating slots, were absolutely full. And it was little things like he had wonderful reception staff who were very customer focused. So they would open up more operating lists rather than fill one properly and then open up another one. If that one didn't suit a patient, they just open up another one and open up another one. So instead of getting, 4 procedures done every operating slot, he was averaging about 3. Now, they were leaving a little bit open because sometimes he has to do emergency stuff. Someone comes in and there's a very nasty, perhaps skin cancer. They don't muck around with those. So he needed to leave some space for that. And then, of course, you get a few people who are sick on the day or don't turn up. So it's easy to see that, perhaps a quarter of his time was being wasted. So the first thing was to fill that up. And that by itself made a huge difference.
That, we talk about pull-based systems in Agile, right?
Yep.
Agile lean, pull-based systems. By creating that, I think you called it, excuse me, I think you called it the short notice patient list, right? So the people who could, if there was a cancellation, I'm not doing anything, I'll come in, I'm available. He literally created a pull system. So he was pulling forward in order to fill his availability, which I thought was like, again, if this is your constraint, you want to keep it busy. Any time with the constraints that's idle is profit lost, revenue lost.
Yeah.
So keep it busy. And then right on the back of that, you had a conversation, which I really think everyone who's listening in the Agile space should think about, the idea of finding the optimal mix of procedures, depending upon the duration and cost, to maximize not only your throughput, but your profit. So we in the Agile world, Mick Kirsten talks about in project to product, your flow distribution. So the work that's coming through, what type of work are you actually doing? And he boils work down into four separate buckets. It's new features, it's defects and bugs, it's risk compliance, and it's technical debt. And like David, if a team chooses to work on all of one type of patient, all one type of work, there are downstream ramifications to that. So if you're only doing new work, you're never fixing any of the defects. Eventually, you're going to develop yourself into a corner. If you're only doing defects, you're not developing any new product. The platform dies on the vine. So much like where David is trying to maximize his throughput and his profit, our listeners, think about the work that your teams are doing and how that balances out, because you don't want to develop yourself into a corner. You don't want to be spending too much time looking backwards, only doing technical debt. You need to find that mix of, again, because the throughput of the new features increases profitability.
Absolutely. So once you've identified your constraint, to me, it's a 2-step process. One is fill all that time with work. And a friend of mine was telling me that he uses a personal trainer, and he was chatting to the personal trainer, and he's busy in the mornings, busy in the evenings, but he's got 3 or 4 hours in the middle of the day where he does nothing but drink coffee. So Carl suggested to him, he said, well, why don't you offer some of your clients who are working out once a week a second session for half price? And of course, as soon as they're doing that. So he offered them 6 weeks of a second session a week. Of course, their results just went up threefold, and he was then able to upgrade them to full noise payment. So first thing is fill up your capacity, and I suspect that for most of you in the agile world, that's not a problem at all. But
yeah,
the second
it's the other way.
is it's okay. So there's a bit of curating, but we'll come to that in a minute. So the second stage is make sure that all your time, whether it's operating, whether it's personal training, whether it's writing code, you're doing the maximum value stuff. And that's when we went through all the procedures that David did, and we worked out how much money he was making on a per minute basis, some of these procedures were worth 4 times as much as the others. So for him to maximize his profit, he needed to change it. Well, it was a mixture of changing the mix of procedures that he did and trying to do more high-end stuff, but also just bumping the price up to make it worthwhile on some of these low-value procedures.
Right. Yeah. Again, if he's the constraint and his time is limited, you want to maximize that within reason to make sure that you're as profitable as you can afford to be, while still generating new work. And that ties to one of the words you used already, which I'd like to go into now: the idea of a buffer, the concept of some of us in the agile world here think of it as slack in the system. But one of the examples you gave as a buffer, which I thought was kind of wild, is the massage therapist and the massage chair, which I thought was an amazing example.
Okay, so this was a lady who she's got a massage studio set up with a table there, but she'd been offered some work whereby she could go out to corporates and bring people in for a massage while they were at work. And for that, she had a special one of those, I don't know if you've seen the chairs, but you sort of slump forward and there's a hole to put your face in and you relax there. Not quite as good as a table, but much more portable. Now, she worked out that optimum time was probably about 20 minutes in the chair. But by the time she's got them all relaxed, it takes them a few minutes to get out of the chair and for her to wipe it down and for the next person to come in. And it meant that her throughput, she should have been in 20 minutes, it would be ideal to put 3 people through, but she was only able to get 2 through because instead of her being the constraint, the chair was the constraint. So, having an accounting background, my first question was, how much would a second chair cost? And, it was something like 450 New Zealand dollars. What's that? 300 odd American dollars, something like that. Basically, she could pay for it within 2 or 3 weeks, have 2 chairs side by side. She didn't have to hurry the person who just finished out. They could have another 5 or 10 minutes sort of relaxing, which meant they felt like they were getting value, but it wasn't taking her time. And she could switch from one to the other and get her output from 2 an hour to 3 an hour.
Which is a simple, again, what a lot of this is like, duh, like, why wouldn't I think of that before? But we're not taught any of this stuff. No.
And, it's so often when you're right in the thick of it, you can't see the forest for the trees. Mm-hmm. And you need, some examples like this perhaps to get you thinking outside your normal way of thinking.
And you tied that to David's example with the autoclave in his office. Yeah. Where, for those listeners who don't know what an autoclave is, you got to run all your tools through that machine. It's used super high heat to clean things and to sterilize everything. He decided a second autoclave will keep his speed up. And he also, and I think later in the book, he goes back to it to say he's actually building in redundancy as well. In the event that something goes out, he has a resource. I think it's a resource buffer for that particular use case.
Yeah, so the autoclave they were getting towards the end of their use by date, and renewing them was really a risk factor, because if they went down, he would have to stop operating. One of the questions, once we got him up to sort of an average of about 4 procedures per operating slot, I said to him, well, what would it take to get to 5 procedures? And, I said, can you cope mentally? And he said, oh, absolutely. Look, when I'm in the zone, when I'm operating, that's my happy place. He just loved being there. So he wasn't the problem. And then he proceeded to tell me that regulations had changed, and they used to be able to do a thing called a flash sterilization, which was relatively quick, and he could turn the instruments around quickly. But the new regulation said they had to sit in the autoclave and be blasted with high pressure steam for at least an hour. So what was happening, if his procedure only went for 45 minutes, the time that he'd saved was being lost waiting for the instruments. So again, the question, well, how much would a set of instruments cost? And, this is a guy who spent 15 years training. He's lived on the bones of his backside for so long. He still is struggling to get round to realizing that he's actually got lots of money. And so he said, they're quite expensive. They're about $3,000. And so I just kept quiet and let him think. And you could see the wheels turning. And he said, I need to get some more instruments, don't I?
And yeah, keep going, Graham.
Yeah. So, he would recover that, within a week and a half. And it was profit from there. And it's the sort of business that has a lot of overhead cost. He's got to rent rooms, he's got receptionists, he's got nurses, he's got all sorts of, insurance costs, obviously. So it might be taking him 2.5 procedures every time just to break even. So the extra procedure he's getting makes a massive, massive difference to his profit.
It's absolutely amazing to think about. And on the back of, you talk about in the book, on the back of buying a second set of instruments, buying a second autoclave, you hit on one of the things that I think is so paramount. He talks about the example you give in the book is the tool layout, where he has to have his tools laid out in a certain way because he works a certain way.
Yeah.
And, again, this is probably another one of those duh moments where he said, I need these laid out in a certain way. And I believe your question to him is, well, why can't you teach someone else to do it? Yeah. And he kind of took a beat and said, well, I guess I could just give them a card and show them how it's laid out. And that ties to your remark of have the non-constraints do as much of the constraint work as possible. And I that's one of the, that's another thing where it should go on a billboard in every development shop in the world, right? Like, have the people, like, if his training and his experience makes him the constraint, right? If there's things that he doesn't need to do, don't have him do them.
Yeah, a blinding flash of the obvious. Have you got your, top people, your highly paid people who should be your constraint, doing things like, taking computers out of paper, cardboard boxes and things like that? What can be done by other people? And so one of the other things that was slowing him down is sometimes the nurses couldn't keep up with him. So again, the idea, well, let's have an extra nurse. But they'll be standing around doing nothing for a while. And, so what? It doesn't matter. But the instrument layer, he has these things, can't remember the technical name. They refer to them as loops. They're basically magnifying glasses that sit in front of his glasses because he's staring at really intricate stuff. So he needs to just be able to reach over and get the instrument and know it's going to be there. And if it's not, he's got to refocus and do things. So to have that running smoothly and relatively simple for him to lay out the instruments for each procedure, take a photo and build a library of that so that the nurses could do that. What we also found is that when he had an extra nurse there, instead of him having to sit with the patient while they recovered and make sure they were coming out of the anesthetic all right, someone else could do that. So it's about, once you've got the constraint, figured out what it is, what work are they doing that can be offloaded to other people, making sure that everything's there ready for them. And I think you refer to full kitting in the agile world. So full kitting is making sure that everything's there. You don't have to stop and do it. And I heard a lovely analogy from Derek, who's in the US Air Force, the other day, and he was talking about chefs like Gordon Ramsay. And I don't know, are you familiar with Jamie Oliver?
Yes.
The English chef? Okay,
yes,
so...
Was he the barefoot chef or something like that? Yeah.
Naked chef,
Naked chef, that's it. I knew it was something where clothes was missing. I was close.
Yeah. Well, he's got a lovely series, 15-minute dinners. And I know that if I buy the book, there's no way I can do it in 15 minutes. He does it on TV because everything's pre-prepared. His cup of flour is already measured out in a bowl. He just tips it in. His half a teaspoon of salt is measured out in a little container. He just tips it all in. Everything's pre-prepared. And so, of course, he can put it together in 15 minutes. But there's no way I can do that. It'll take me 15 minutes just to find the ingredients in the pantry, in the fridge.
Right.
So it's that concept. Get everything ready to go. So once you start the job, you can complete it as much as possible.
It's the same. My brother is a restaurant guy up in New York, and it's the same what they do in chefs' kitchens, right? Like you have your mirepoix in a certain place, your flour, your egg wash, everything is laid out in a particular way at almost every station so that you can swap back and forth, and you don't like you said, it's like the guy wearing the loops on his eyes. You don't have to stop and say, wait a minute, where is the flour? Where is the carving knife? It's there, and it's in a place where you expect it. So you can just, you can move. The other thing about having the non-constraint do as much as the constraint work as possible. We just had an episode where we talked about the book Team Topologies. And one of the theories in Team Topologies is you should lay out your teams to minimize cognitive load, right? So if there are certain things that you shouldn't have to know in order to really do your job well, you shouldn't do them. For example, if I'm a really, really great iOS developer, I shouldn't really need to have to understand. I should conceptually understand, but I shouldn't need to do every day plugging in the deployment module to make sure it writes to the correct environment, right? That's something cognitively I shouldn't be able to do. I shouldn't have to do. That may be a butchered example. There's definitely somebody yelling at their phone right now. But the point being is you need to concentrate on the high value work that you do. And your high value work for that person is writing iOS code. So that's what they should be most concerned about, not the how do I get the code in the right environment, or all the switches in the correct order so it'll work.
Yeah, not the peripheral stuff. It's the the money shot, the stuff that's going to bring in the money. And I mean, I'm an accountant and I talk about money a lot. If you're not making money in your organization, then sooner or later you're going to go broke and everyone's going to lose their job. It's part of the process. You've got to have happy people. You've got to have happy customers, and you've got to have a happy bank account.
There you go. All three. And I'm glad you brought up money, because that takes us to one of the later passages in the book. And I pulled up the quote earlier where if I don't spend money on the bottleneck, don't spend the money at all, where Mark has an LED dermoscope. Right? Can we talk about that and how you guys, how you walked me through the logic where this actually does make sense?
David came to me and because we got through that. First of all, you want to spend money only on the bottleneck. And if you've ever wondered why you've spent a whole lot of money trying to get the organization to go better and nothing changes, nothing hits the bottom line, it's probably because you're not spending it on the bottleneck. That's your leverage point. That's where you go to start with. So first of all, spend money there if you have to, but the key is don't increase your bottleneck capacity until you've fully utilized what you've already got. That's your free capacity, and just by thinking about, are we using it efficiently? Are we using it effectively? That usually gives you a bit of a bang for the buck. Then you want to spend perhaps a bit of money on protecting the bottleneck, but don't increase capacity until you have to. Anyway, David came to me and he said, look, there's this opportunity, mole mapping, and I'm not sure, what it's like where you are, but down here in New Zealand, the sun is pretty brutal. Skin cancers are a real problem, and they change relatively slowly until they don't. And the idea with mole mapping is you go and you strip off, this machine takes photos of you digitally, and then you go back a year later and it can track any of your moles that are changing and are likely to be or potentially cancerous. So it was a huge investment, and it didn't help him as a bottleneck at all. But what it did do is it gave him a source of income that didn't actually need to go near the bottleneck. Every other part of his business had to go through him. So it was important that he was as effective as possible. This was one of those things that it was a source of income that would bypass the bottleneck. So as far as he was concerned, it was free money. And once we went through the figures, it made absolutely perfect sense. And once he got that going, trained some staff to run it, he was able to go on vacation and make money while he was away. And that was the first time that had happened for years.
If we should all be so lucky to be earning income while we're on vacation. And I think you even talked about in the book how it downstream, it made his life easier, because when someone did have a problem, he had a history of where he had to look. So you want to talk about increased throughput. He knew he could literally, pardon the pun, surgically target where he needed to go, because he had that reference point already built in.
Yeah, he could. What tends to happen with these things is the doctors don't want to leave anything behind, and it might be a relatively small mole, but they carve out a huge hunk of flesh just to make sure they don't leave anything behind. Well, with this new technology, he was able to limit the damage, and especially if the mole is on your face or is visible, people really don't like big ugly scars on them if they can avoid it.
My dad had one taken out of his head, and it looked like they went at him with a melon baller. I'm like, Dad, what the hell happened to you?
Well, and that's them just making really, really sure that there's nothing cancerous left behind. But with the better technology, he can do a nicer, cleaner job that's just as safe. And of course, some people are willing to pay extra so that they don't have, those huge holes in them.
Right. And to that end, you talk about there's 4 things you should spend your money on. And everybody who's listening, get a pen and write these down. The first thing you should spend your money on is things that increase constraint productivity, right? If cloning ever becomes a thing, David's got an option there, right? Things that increase the money the constraint earns during productivity. That's things like the autoclave, things like the extra nurse, the tool alignment. Things that can protect the constraint from being idle. So that's filling the funnel, right? Filling the schedule to make sure that he is busy at all times. And then this is the last one, which we just talked about, things that earn money without consuming constraint capacity. So this is that quasi passive income that he's got coming in that downstream also provides additional value on top of, like you said, earning money while you're on vacation. That's really a kind of cool thought.
Yeah. And he also, they were selling a few, creams and gels and various things at reception. And so they'd never really focused on that. So now they have a much wider range of things, and the receptionists are not exactly pushy, but they're certainly mentioning it to people a lot more. It's not huge amounts of money in the big scheme of things, but it all helps.
Right. Every little bit helps. The last thing you talk about in the book, Graham, which I think is really important, and everybody should be so smart to do this with their customers, the idea of curation. Can we talk about how he did some of his curation regarding like patient demographics and, for lack of a better term, non-value add customers?
Yeah. So the idea of curation comes from, basically the whole process is the theory of constraints, 5 focusing steps. So find your bottleneck, optimize it, then coordinate everything so it's just nice smoothly into the bottleneck, collaborate, and that is the word we use to mean offload everything to other people that you possibly can, and then curate. I'll come back to that in a second, but the next step after that is upgrade. So once you've got your bottleneck running at full capacity and everything around it going, then that's when you add the turbocharger, or buy another developer or something like that. And then the last thing is start again. It's an ongoing process. Just check that now that everything's running really well, your bottleneck hasn't shifted. But so the curate bit, in a museum, they will have hundreds of thousands of things, but they can't all be on display. You might have a tenth of what is available actually out on display. And the curator of the museum, their job is to decide what not to display. And I think that's a real key. So for David, it was about deciding what procedures he wasn't going to do anymore. They just weren't worth it for him. He didn't enjoy them. And the most important thing was probably deciding which customers he didn't want to work with. And we had a conversation. For him, if he's doing the job properly, the patients he sees they're not repeat customers. He deals with their problem and off they go again. But to get in to see David, he has GPs, general practitioner doctors, who are referring him their patients when they have a problem. And I said to him, do you ever look at a patient referral, see the name of the doctor at the bottom, and your heart just sinks? You know that person's going to be trouble. I mean, certain doctors, they attract a certain class of patients, and you know that they're the ones who aren't going to turn up for surgery. They're the ones that aren't going to do all the follow-up instructions, so there's going to be complications, and they're the ones who won't pay. And he said, he just rolled his eyes and said, oh, yeah. So stop seeing them, stop dealing with them. And, for someone who's in healthcare, the idea of turning people away, that was a bit of a head shift. But most of what he does is not life and death. And there are other options available in town. And one of the other options in town he doesn't particularly get on with. So the idea of sending all his troublesome patients down the road to see him really tickled his fancy. And of course, he was also worried that the staff, a lot of nursing staff, receptionists, they're all very caring people. And he was worried that there would be a bit of a backlash from them about turning patients away. But the type of patients that he was looking at turning away, they were really happy because they were the ones that had to deal with them.
Right. Chase them down for payment, chase them down to make sure they're doing their post-op. It's more work for them and stress for them. It just, it becomes exponential at some point. It's just heading for everybody.
It does. And they're just not nice people, some of them. And life's too short to deal with that. So curating is the part of the process about deciding what we're not going to do, what work we're not going to do, what customers we're not going to have.
And that ties to some of the things we do in our world, like, because I've noticed that where some of the teams struggle, it's the product genesis piece. It's where the ideas are coming into the team. And not saying that we can turn away work, but that's where things like the definition of ready come into play in our agile world, where I have these five or six attributes that need to be complete in order for me to take in your work. And teams that have a good, solid definition of ready that is public and it's available and everybody knows, you have the not excuse, but you have the rationale to toss something out of your process because it's like, look, I need A, B, C, D, and E, and you set me 2 out of 5. So,
but can't you just make a start and I'll get that to you later?
And then what happens?
No, because then I'm going to have to put it down and come back to it, and we've got switching costs, we've got all sorts of things.
Right, and all that does is that's like the idle guy picking up another ticket because he's got. You're just putting strain into the system that's not.
Yeah.
So Graham, let me ask you this. I mean, it's a short book. It's an easy read, and yet, my
Yeah.
God, there's all these life altering bon mots to take it here. What's next for you?
Well, I've got a couple more books on the go. One is, and we touched on it briefly earlier, this need to get to have happy customers, happy staff, and a happy bank account. And unfortunately, what happens or seems to happen in lots of businesses, you've got the CFO saying, well, to get a happy bank account, we need to lift our prices and cut our costs. And then you've got the people who are in charge of the customers saying, well, if we want to keep our customers happy, we need to offer more value. So we've got to cut our price and we've got to offer more service. So we need more hours from our people. And then you've got the HR people saying, well, we need to spend more money on our people and we need them to spend less time at work. And all of a sudden, you've got these major clashes between keeping our staff happy, keeping our customers happy, keeping our profit where it should be and keeping our staff happy, or keeping our profit where it should be and keeping our customers happy. And having the overall view to understand that all three are, none is more important than the others, but they all rely so heavily on each other.
Right. They're all tightly coupled.
Expanding that, and yeah, absolutely. And at the end of the day, the profit is the last piece of it. Your staff, your customers rather, if they're happy, that tells you how we're doing right now. And if your staff are unhappy, that's a bit of a heads up as to where the business is going to be in 6 months' time.
Right.
Good.
So that's fantastic. We look forward to having you on again when the next book, next book or books come out. So
that would be wonderful.
To wrap us up, Graham, if people want to get in touch with you, they want to learn more about you. Maybe they want to pick your brain. Where do they go to find you?
I'm grahamwscott.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I think should be reasonably easy to find. I'm sure there'll be an email address on the show notes.
Yep.
So, yeah, by all means, fire something through. We can have a Zoom and a catch up. And if you've read the book, we'll have a good starting place.
Awesome. So once again, Graham, I want to thank you for coming on. This has been so much fun. It's great to see you and great to chat. Looking forward to seeing more of the work you develop. On behalf of Graham and myself, I want to thank all of you listeners for tuning in once again. You know the deals. Shout out to Krebs for doing our outro music. Find us on Discord, get into the conversation. We've had some really good dialogue thus far. We do have a Patreon. We actually now have a new Patreon level where while we are committed to being free, once a quarter, we'll send you some swag. So maybe you get some shirts or socks or something. Who knows? Maybe I'll send you one of my books that's all highlighted with notes, the secret to my genius. So once again, and thank you, Graham. And until next time, this is the Agile Uprising Podcast signing out.
Thank you very much.